Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for Brainwashed, How a Myth About Human Programming Changed History. Today we have faculty, parents, staff, students, and Miamians representing the classes of 1957 through 2022 with us. My name is Michelle Rosecrans. I am the Director of Alumni Engagement for the Miami University Alumni Association, and we're really excited to continue our series of Miami Presents in partnership with Miami faculty and alumni and lots of others who have been really generous with their time. Today, our presenter is Dr. Tim Melley, a professor of English and director of the Humanities Center at Miami University. A favorite presenter among Miami alumni, Dr. Melley is a teacher of American narrative and cultural history, and he's the recipient of 4 teaching awards and the Benjamin Harrison Medallion for extraordinary teaching, research, and service at Miami. He is the author of more than 30 essays and short stories and 2 books, Empire of Conspiracy, The Culture of Paranoia in Post-War America, and The Covert Sphere, Secrecy, Fiction, and the National Security State. He's lectured widely in the United States and abroad, including Britain, Germany, Norway, Canada, South Korea, and Sweden. And his work has been covered by The Nation, BBC, LA Times, Village Voice, Le Figaro, Scientific American, The Wall Street Journal, and This American Life. I'll turn it over to Dr. Melley now. Thank you again so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be with all of you out there, even though I can't see you. I'm trusting that you're there. And I want to take a minute just at the beginning, before I talk to you about brainwashing, to invite you to become a friend of the Miami University Humanities Center. Michelle, if you could maybe show the website of the center. I'd like to invite you to visit our website, which is just humanitiescenter.miamioh.edu, and learn a little about what we do. We run 15 programs to put people together in innovative ways and challenge them to think about serious problems that are facing the world. We do this across the university every year with an annual theme that takes on a major social challenge. We run all kinds of programs to get students practical experience, to put them in research collaborations with faculty. We have a program that focuses on employment for students. And we do a lot to help faculty get outside their own areas and start working across the university with other people on big ideas. We're doing a program this year for alumni, which is called Objects That Change the World. The objects in question there are 10 of them. They range from concrete and porcelain to the birth control pill and the photograph. So I hope you will come to these lectures. They're by award-winning professors. What we're trying to do is invite alumni to come back and remember why the humanities are and have always been the kind of core of liberal arts education. We need leaders with perspective and empathy. We need students who understand how to tell stories, how stories work. In fact, some of the things I'm going to talk about today and some of the things that you have asked me about are directly related to our capacity to think critically about ideas. So that brings me back to brainwashing, and I'm going to share my screen with you. We'll just take a second. As I do this, I'm going to invite you to think about why brainwashing is such a popular notion. It's a very weird idea, the notion that there are ways to control human beings with external means. Sorry, I'm stumbling a little because I'm trying to share my screen. There we go. Let's see. I hope you can see that. Michelle, are we good? Can you see that?
Yes, we're great.
Okay.
I can see it.
So I want to talk to you about how this idea became so popular. Why are we so suffused with the idea of brainwashing? Why has it become a popular American way of thinking about social influence? Where did it come from? Why did it stick? And what I'm going to suggest is that it it gave people a way of thinking about what we might call ideology that works in an American framework. And I'm going to start by, I'm going to tell this story in multiple ways, and I'm not going to tell it in order. I'm going to start, in fact, at the end by noticing how popular brainwashing is in our discourse right now. And then I'm going to go back to the beginning, and I'm going to look at where this notion came from. And I'm going to do that a couple of times, because it turns out there's a public story about this concept, and then there's a secret story that has to do with US intelligence, and I need to separate those. So I just want to note that, you know, we thought a lot about brainwashing recently in the War on Terror. You may remember John Walker Lind, the so-called American Taliban guy. There were lots of charges all across the world that people who were Islamic radicalists might have been brainwashed. The Home Secretary in Britain, suggested that people needed to be deprogrammed. The highway shooter Lee Malvo was understood as being brainwashed. Some victims of kidnapping and abuse have been understood as brainwashed. Brainwashing is both fictional and real as a set of ideas. It intersects with the things that we watch on television, which are often sort of melodramatic and heightened, and with real incidents. So one of the ways that we think about brainwashing these days is not just in the news, but through the things we watch for entertainment. The show Homeland was a very popular show about the national security state, and it involved the notion of brainwashing. It actually revived the Manchurian Candidate, which is by far the most influential depiction of brainwashing, and it's something that we're going to look at in a little more detail. It's for a 1962 film. But brainwashing has had a really, really prominent history in our culture. There have been movies and television shows about brainwashing from the 1960s to the present. And I'm just giving you, with these slides that I'm sort of racing through here, I'm just trying to give you a sense of how popular the notion of brainwashing is. In all of these fictions, there are people who undergo some sort of mysterious mind control process that is deeply worrying to other people. And this idea is, it has memes that sort of run through our culture. We all remember, probably most of us remember A Clockwork Orange. We may remember the sort of 70s era thrillers like A Parallax View, which has a brainwashing scene. There aren't really too many movies for me to walk through here. But my point in opening here is really just, this is a notion that we are buried in. So where does it come from? Well, one of the tools we can use to answer that question is Google's Ngram tool. Google Ngram is a computer tool that tells us where words became popular, when they became popular. It searches basically everything that's on Google Books and newspapers for the incidence of a term. And what we see here is that brainwashing and brain-washing, which are the two versions of the term, are Cold War terms. They came to prominence around 1950. And I'll tell you really where they came to prominence in a minute. But I just want to note that there's a much older set of ideas about secret, mysterious forms of influence that, is a long-standing worry in Western culture. These are images mostly from the 19th and 18th century, and they describe mesmerism, animal magnetism, and hypnotism, which were different versions of the notion of brainwashing, which again suggests that people have a mysterious power to control the actions and thoughts or memories of another human being. I just want to point out, while we're on this slide, the way that this notion is gendered. That is, the way that gender is imagined in most notions of brainwashing and hypnotism. What we're seeing here are male male hypnotists or mesmerists controlling females. And we will come back to that in the Manchurian Candidate. So the term brainwashing really came into usage in 1950 when a guy named Edward Hunter published an article in the Miami Sunday News in 1950. He claimed that brainwashing was a practice in China that was starting to transform Chinese people and convert them into communists. The term itself was used prior to 1950, and I'm going to skip this slide. I'm going to go over this slide very quickly. It was really not used significantly. The person that brought the modern notion of brainwashing into being was Edward Hunter. And he did it mainly in this first book. He wrote many books about brainwashing. The first one was published in 1951, and he claimed in it that brainwashing is a form of psychological warfare on a scale incalculably more immense than any militarist of the past has ever envisaged. He said it's a tool for political indoctrination in which propaganda is applied to everyone. What he was describing was really a form of Maoist thought reform that was going on in China. Large numbers of people were incarcerated and forced through programs of so-called re-education. These programs involved them writing confessions, reading those confessions publicly, revising the confessions, and this process often went on for years as a way of kind of indoctrinating people. You can see on the cartoon on the right that the notion of the brain being washed was circulating in China in the 1940s. Now, brainwashing really exploded in the United States in response to the Korean War. In 1952, a group of US Air Force POWs, most importantly Colonel Frank Schwabel, confessed to dropping biological weapons on North Korea. 35 other captured pilots confirmed those confessions, which were not true. The US didn't do the things that these pilots confessed to. To the embarrassment of the military and many Americans, almost 5,000 of 7,200 American POWs signed confessions by the end of the war. And this prompted a huge sort of national debate about what was going on. The debate got worse when a number of prisoners actually refused repatriation. 23 prisoners said that they were going to stay in China. They defected, and the Chinese marched them around and made a great big thing about these conversions. The administration was very concerned about these events, even before the problems or the issue with the 23 men. Eisenhower went public in saying that the Cold War was a new kind of war. It was going to require a tremendous psychological effort, and he openly embraced the idea of psychological warfare. More privately, he told his administration that he wanted to develop new subversion and propaganda weapons with no government connection. In other words, he wanted to do it secretly, and we'll come back to that later. At the same time, the military began to develop a system for preparing American troops for potential brainwashing or incarceration. This program eventually became known as the SERE program. SERE is spelled S-E-R-E, and it's an acronym that means Survival, Evasion, Resistance, Escape. We'll come back to that program too, because the SERE program tried to imagine what brainwashing was like, and then to develop a program of simulated brainwashing that would be done to toughen up American troops on American soil before they were deployed. I want to point out, while we're on this slide, that many of the, which is from 1956, that many of the things depicted here are now features of what is known as enhanced interrogation in the United States, the small box, the stress positions, and so forth. Again, this is something that we will return to. So the military was open about its SEER program. It announced that it was planning to prepare troops for brainwashing. And Edward Hunter in particular launched a massive PR campaign. He was constantly in the news talking about brainwashing, trying to create sympathy for US POWs. There was a great deal of national hand-wringing about the POW situation. And so a lot of people began to try to suggest to the public that something truly diabolical had been done to these troops. As the 50s rolled on, the notion of brainwashing became increasingly magical and increasingly diabolical. Stories about it received huge national distribution. Here's these articles, which were published in many newspapers around the country in 1954, depict Cardinal Mindszenty, the Hungarian cardinal who confessed in a communist show trial. So that was a theme that was often linked to brainwashing. Edward Hunter even wrote an article before the repatriation scandal, noting that it was likely to happen and trying to sway the public about the need to be sensitive to returning prisoners. At the same time, a film came out called Prisoner of War, starring Ronald Reagan, that was also very sympathetic to prisoners of war in China during the Korean War. But there was a lot of criticism of the people who were incarcerated and returned. And this just gives you a sense. This is from the Mike Wallace interview program in 1957. It gives you a sense of the national tenor about this.
The Mike Wallace interview. My guest tonight is the youngest U.S. Army turncoat of the Korean War. You'll see him behind me. He's David Hawkins of Oklahoma City. We'll try to find out why Dave Hawkins turned his back on the United States. Couldn't stomach the Red China, Dave. Was brainwashing that they subjected you to. And I would like you to tell us what it's like to be subjected to communist brainwashing.
At the same time, there was a growing scientific discourse about what might have happened in some of these cases. They were frequently linked together. On the right of this article, which appeared in Maclean's in 1955, you see Colonel Schwabel, who was one of the POWs who confessed to war crimes. And you see Cardinal Mindszenty in the second picture. So a lot of the public press about the so-called brainwashing incidents in Korea began to connect other cases of coercive persuasion. In 1956, Hunter published another book. This one was with a much bigger press, and it was an incredibly popular book that went through multiple printings. This book, it's notable how different the account of brainwashing in this book is. By 1956, Hunter was describing brainwashing as a form of mass hypnosis that creates, quote, an unthinking discipline and robot-like enslavement. His language became increasingly Orientalist. It suggested that there was some sort of magical Asian flair to the practice of brainwashing, and that it was underpinned by Russian Pavlovian science. So here's a kind of typical passage from this book. Brainwashing is like witchcraft, with its incantations, trances, poisons, and potions, with a strange flair of science about it all, like a devil dancer in a tuxedo carrying his magic brew in a test tube. It can change a mind radically so that its owner becomes a living puppet, a human robot, without the atrocity being visible from the outside. This notion was in some ways supported. This notion became the notion that underpinned a lot of what we see in the movies. That there's this kind of magical technique that can remove all human autonomy, that can turn a person into a robot under the control of somebody else. This idea fed into a lot of Cold War discourse about the dangers of communism, but it's a fairly extreme idea. So the question is, how did this idea become? Why did it not sort of end in the way that McCarthyism ended, right? Why didn't it sort of after the Korean War ended and the POW situation sort of came to a close? Why didn't it fade out in the way that many other of the Cold War hysteria did? And the answer is, I think, threefold. First, it was supported by experts. The notion of brainwashing became a kind of scientifically endorsed idea. Second, it was connected to a much broader set of concerns in American culture. And third, it became a metaphor for the Cold War itself. So those are really the three reasons I think this idea became persuasive. So let me back up and just walk through those three arguments one at a time. The first one is that there was a kind of scientific and emerging scientific consensus about brainwashing. Two scientists in particular, Joost Meerloo and William Sargent, gave scientific credibility to the idea of brainwashing. And one of the things that's notable about their work is the way that it, on the one hand, suggests that brainwashing is a horrific form of total human control, and on the other hand, a rather ordinary form of influence. Meerloo goes back and forth between these descriptions of brainwashing as a form of influence that's hard to separate from other normal kinds of influence, and a form of coercive persuasion that is horrifying in its implications. At one point, he says it can make conditioned zombies out of people. The same is true of the other major expert here, William Sargent, who talked about brainwashing in a slightly different context. He talked about it in the context of religious conversion. Sargent was famous from the Second World War as somebody that worked with traumatized veterans. The Second World War. He worked with traumatized veterans and developed a reputation in the military. But he wrote this book in which he basically says, like Meerloo, that brainwashing is a dangerous form of influence, but also a rather ordinary sort of ideological conditioning. So I want to stress that about these two expert accounts, because what we're going to see is that dual sense that brainwashing is an extreme and horrifying form of human control, and that it's not that different from other kinds of influence, is something that just runs through all of the thinking about brainwashing. The other thing I want to point out about these two experts is that their work drew on fiction for its exploration of brainwashing. And I find this fascinating. They discuss Aldous Huxley, Arthur Koestler, George Orwell, and other fictional scenarios as the basis of their understanding of this practice. One of the things that's notable about the idea of brainwashing is the way that fiction and reality keep kind of merging. And you see that even in these two expert accounts. Now, the second reason that brainwashing was, I think, salient and really took hold in the United States is that it gave people a way of thinking about a much broader set of concerns that were being articulated all across US culture. There was this widespread sense that advertising and mass culture was turning people into easily manipulated subjects. It was turning them into organization men, or it was making them less autonomous. It was making them one-dimensional. There was a huge sort of cultural theme about the possibility of conformity taking over the autonomy and individuality of human beings. And this picked up on an older tradition of worry about advertising and the way that the public sphere might be corrupted by certain kinds of influence. Here in the middle of this slide, you see this very famous book by Edward Bernays, who's sometimes called the father of public relations and advertising. And his book is called Propaganda. He saw his work as basically doing propaganda to get people to buy stuff that they might not otherwise think of. In the 50s and 60s, these notions became incredibly, they became melodramatized by really popular books. One of them, The Hidden Persuaders by Vance Packard, and the other, Subliminal Seduction, in a little bit later by Wilson Bryan Key, suggested that people are susceptible to all kinds of influence. There were concerns that television had a sort of eerie hypnotic power. At the same time, there were ideas about the science of brainwashing began to enter the public sphere. There were television shows about and magazine articles about scientific research on mind control. And that led to the recirculation of the brainwashing narrative in other cases. So it was recirculated in the Vietnam War. It was recirculated in the Gary Francis Powers case when Powers was shot down. The idea began to become, experts started to suggest that brainwashing was more widespread than we might realize, that it was not that unusual to come under forms of psychological influence. People started using brainwashing in all kinds of contexts. They used it to describe school and various other kinds of normal social control. In 1975, the Patty Hearst case kind of blew up the brainwashing debate again, and so did the rise of so-called cults, the Moonies in particular, and Jim Jones's Jonestown incident. And so all of this led to this sort of culture of brainwashing that we started with. The third thing I want to note, however, is that brainwashing is really a metaphor for Cold War itself. It picks up on the idea that the Cold War is a war of ideas. It's a war of propaganda and influence in which one side is trying to convert the other side to its position. And you really see that in the most important fiction of brainwashing, which is the Manchurian Candidate. And I want to just show the stunning opening scene from this film.
The war in Korea was over. Captain, now Major Bennett Marco, had been reassigned to Army intelligence in Washington. It was, by and large, a pleasant assignment, except for one thing. Night after night, the Major was plagued by the same reoccurring nightmare.
Stop.
Another modern discovery, which we owe to the hydrangea, concerns the influence of air drainage upon plant climate. Many years ago, when I was traveling about the country, I noticed magnificent hydrangeas on the hills, where the air drainage was perfect, and very poor specimens, or perhaps none at all, in the valleys. Formerly, we used to consider sheltered valleys more favorable to plants than hilltops. but the avoidance of late spring and early autumn frost enjoyed by sites with good air drainage, where the cold air can drain safely away to lower levels, gives the hills a decided advantage. Thus, it was the hydrangeas that gave the first pointer in another modern discovery of horticultural importance. From this, it might appear that the hydrangea is a fairly simple plant, but there are more complications. The cultivation of hydrangeas was evolved from a number of varieties originally found in Japan, not all of which, of course, have the same characteristics. Two of them do not share the quality of producing blue flowers in mineral-rich soils.
Allow me to introduce our American visitors. I must ask you to forgive their somewhat lackadaisical manners, but I have conditioned them, or brainwashed them, which I understand is the new American word, to believe that they are waiting out a storm in the lobby of a small hotel in New Jersey, where a meeting of the Ladies' Garden Club is in progress.
You will notice that I have told them they may smoke. I've allowed my people to have a little fun in the selection of bizarre tobacco substitutes.
Now, what happens next is that the lead communist scientist instructs Raymond Shaw, the protagonist, who's depicted in this slide in the bottom, to murder one of his fellow Americans, and he gets up and calmly does that. But what I want to note about the scene is a couple of things. It's a stunning shot because it's a 720-degree continuous shot that's technically really virtuosic. But what it suggests is, first of all, that these men are completely controlled by external suggestion, and also that their consciousness and perception have been replaced by an allegory of reality. They are literally in the sort of heart of, world communism, but they believe themselves to be safe in a domestic American space. Second, that site, that American site, is a site of female activity. It is a feminine site. The inmost chamber of communism here is laid over a sort of bourgeois woman's club. And I think this scene is in some ways a metaphor for the nature of Cold War, in which these men are fighting a battle that is quite serious and quite real at one level. And in another, they are just in a domestic American space. So the notion here is that the Cold War happens all the time, and it does happen in the domestic realm. The other thing I want to stress about this scene, or about this film, is the way that it emphasizes female influence over insufficiently masculine men, which was a major theme of the Cold War. It was part of an idea that circulated partly through the work of Philip Wiley, known as momism. Momism was the theory that overly doting mothers were weakening men and making them susceptible to communism. And the Manchurian Candidate really plays with this idea. In fact, the film is less concerned, I think, about communist brainwashing than it is about the influence of women on men. The film has three women. One of them is Raymond Shaw's domineering mother, who turns out to be a communist agent and who uses this Queen of Diamonds card to control him. This is the literal mechanism for brainwashing. But there are two other blonde women in this film who also have a sort of eerie hypnotic power over the men they're around. One of them is Josie, who is Raymond Shaw's love interest. She's depicted in the middle of this screen. And at one point, with no real explanation, she shows up to a costume party dressed as the Queen of Diamonds. So in other words, she just happens to select a costume that is the card that controls Raymond Shaw's brainwashing. right? And then the other figure here is Rosie, who is the love interest of Frank Sinatra, Major Marco. And I'll just show you a quick scene of the way that this film plays with the notion of female influence. Here, Marco is upset. He's been having these nightmares. And this is a scene of seduction where Janet Leigh's character, Rosie, chases him into this compartment between trains and basically picks him up. So we'll just listen to part of this.
Are you married?
No. You?
Oh.
What's your last name?
Jane. I'm production assistant for a man named Justin, who had 2 hits last season. I live on 54th Street, a few doors from the Modern Museum of Art, of which I'm a tea privileges member. No cream. I live at 53 West 54th Street, apartment 3B. Can you remember that?
Yes.
Eldorado 59970. Can you remember that?
Yes.
Are you stationed in New York? Or is stationed the right word?
So that's one way to get a date, right? Notice how Frank Sinatra's character seems to be in a brainwashed state as he's receiving these suggestions. And later, he does remember this phone number and address, and he takes a cab there and ends up marrying Rosie. So the point I want to make about this film is that it overlays this dire notion of communist mind control and assassination with a much more kind of ordinary domestic form of influence. And those two worries get entangled. There's a lot more to say about that, but I want to conclude by taking about 7 more minutes, 5 to 6 more minutes, to now go back and look at the underlying secret history that informs some of the things I've already talked about. The first thing I want to note is that Edward Hunter was not just a journalist. He was a CIA propaganda specialist. And he was the editor of a journal called Tactics. He described himself as a psychological warfare expert. And his work really was to promote the idea of brainwashing as a terrifying communist weapon. The goal of that campaign was to frighten Americans about communism and to make sure that they were defensive. That tied into other efforts to make Americans wary of communists. The other thing to note is that the idea of brainwashing did not start with the Korean War. Edward Hunter started to circulate this idea long before the prisoners came back from Korea, and also studies of hypnosis and drug use as a form of coercion were underway by the 1950s, again, largely because of the show trials in Europe. But by 1953, the CIA director, John Dulles, was so worried about a mind control gap with the Soviets that he gave a public lecture in which he described brainwashing as a serious threat. And he behind the scenes did 2 more specific things. The first thing he did was he commissioned a study of brainwashing by 2 scientists, Hinkle and Wolff. And the other thing he did was to launch a series of programs that attempted to develop an American mind control weapon. There were several programs in this vein. The first one was called Bluebird. Later that was turned into Project Artichoke, and eventually all of this led to what became called Project MK Ultra, which was a multi-million-dollar behavior control effort that really was incredibly salacious. People were given drugs against their will. They were incarcerated. They were subjected to really grotesque experiments that the historian Alfred McCoy has called the Manhattan Project of mind control. It's a really awful chapter in the history of the United States. There's a huge amount of documentation about this. People were subjected often against their will. Mental patients were often used as guinea pigs in some of these experiments. And all of that work really led to the conclusion that there was no way to control people with some magical technique. That's what Hinkle and Wolff concluded in their study. And this notion, so this is the Hinkle and Wolff study here, which reported back to Dulles and said basically there's nothing mysterious about the personality changes resulting from the brainwashing process. Brainwashing is basically torture. So that's what the CIA experts concluded. If you take people and you lock them up and you force them into horrible stress and you deprive them and you ask them to confess and revise their stories, some of them will eventually comply with you. Some of them will do it strategically for a time. Others will do it and be permanently affected by it. That idea was confirmed by a very good study by Robert J. Lifton, who started studying brainwashing in 52 and concluded in published his study in 1961, basically said the same thing. The other thing that, so in some ways, the CIA's effort to create a brainwashing mechanism was a failure, but it did lead to this, which is the CIA's so-called Kubark manual. The Kubark manual is a manual for interrogation. It was distributed by the CIA, and it's still used as the basis of what we now call enhanced interrogation. And you can see by the red box the kinds of things this manual instructs interrogators in how to do, how to deprive people of sensory stimuli, reset the clocks when they're asleep, create a sense of unreality, use drugs, and so forth. I want to just conclude by talking for 2 minutes about the case of Abu Zubaydah, who was captured by the United States in the War on Terror. The CIA thought that Zubaydah was the #3 ranking al-Qaeda operator. And they flew him around the world and incarcerated him. And he was initially interrogated by 2 FBI agents with significant experience in interrogation. They both spoke Arabic. But about 3 days into the interrogation, they were removed and replaced by a team that had no experience with interrogation, that did not speak Arabic, but that was in charge of running the SEER program. You may remember the SEER program is the way that the US military inoculates troops against potential mind control or potential coercion. It's a badge of honor among elite US troops to go through this program. It's apparently unbelievably brutal and difficult. One of the psychologists running this program was placed in charge of the interrogation of Abu Zubaydah. And Zubaydah he was waterboarded 80 times. He was placed in stress positions. This document is from his hearing, his tribunal, in which, the places that are sort of highlighted here describe his treatment. I won't go into too much detail because I'm almost out of time, but the treatment he endured was unbelievable. And you notice on the right side, he basically says, after a while, I just decided to confess. In fact, Zubaydah did confess to doing all kinds of terrible things. He confessed to trying to blow up the Golden Gate Bridge, trying to blow up the Brooklyn Bridge, and a whole bunch of other things. None of those things were true. In fact, Zubaydah was not a member of al-Qaeda. His testimony is remarkably compelling because he openly admits that he was an enemy of the United States, but he was actually an enemy of al-Qaeda as well. So what I want to finish what I want to say in conclusion here, by the way, these are his drawings, the drawings that he made of his own incarceration. I want to conclude by saying that brainwashing, as a magical fantasy for human control, there really is no such thing. But it certainly is true that if you incarcerate people and you subject them to tremendous physical stress, you can get them to confess to all kinds of things. And ironically, this notion of brainwashing started as a propaganda fiction. The fiction, which was circulated by Hunter, became so powerful that it actually worried US military planners, who then built a system to basically prepare people for this process. And then the process, ironically, was used 50 years later against the enemies that the United States captured in the War on Terror. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and take questions from the audience.
Thank you so much, Dr. Melley. So we've had a couple of questions that were submitted ahead of time asking about the connection between social media and what we would currently think of as brainwashing today. One of them is how is social media creating and reinforcing brainwashing opportunities? And the other was can you talk about how social media contributes to brainwashing? Mm-hmm. So just lightly maybe touch on that.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's really important to think about what we mean by brainwashing when we use that term, right? People use the term loosely to refer to influence. And so the first thing to say is that, I think I would like to suggest that brainwashing, at least as it sort of emerged as a real practice, is basically a form of torture in which people are incarcerated and subject to really horrible, unbearable stress in which they're likely to say and do whatever their captors want. But it's also notable, as I was trying to suggest, that brainwashing became a metaphor for all kinds of influence. Now, if we think about it in that much broader sense of just social influence, then one of the things we ought to ask ourselves is, why are we using a term that is so melodramatic to describe influence? And one of the reasons I ask that question is because I think it's important for us to be able to think about the way that we influence one another and the ways that we are influenced by the things we take in, right? And Americans, for a whole bunch of reasons I won't get into right now, the US tradition really emphasizes rugged individualism and individuals who are safe from influence. And that makes it very hard for us to accept that we might be influenced. But all of us are influenced all the time. For instance, I often invite my students to think about books a little bit differently. Usually people think of books as things that they take in, and they take in as nourishment. So by that way of thinking, a book is something that I take into me, and it kind of feeds me. And when I'm done, I put it aside and maybe I take in another one. But a different way of thinking about a book is that a book is a machine that you go through. And when you come out the other side, you might be different. So we're all susceptible to being influenced by the things we read. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I want to be influenced by smart people. I want to be persuaded to think in the way that they want me to. And I also want the critical capacity to weigh their ideas and know when not to be influenced by them. Social media is a really dangerous way of, it's a new media ecosystem that allows people to curate what they're seeing. Actually, social media simply curate what we are seeing through an algorithm that's based on keeping our attention on the same things. So it has the capacity to reinforce the same ideas over and over again and give us a false sense that there's a huge amount of support for a particular idea. I think the questions that you're, Michelle, that you're kind of pulling together there all speak to the very real worry that many of us have, that people are being influenced too much by what they're reading on their social media, and they haven't developed the critical capacity to think better about what authorizes certain ideas.
Sure. It's interesting how we joke now. I was influenced to buy this hair dryer, and we can, be lighthearted about it, but seeing it over and over again in your Instagram feed or wherever you're seeing it, it does do that. So there was a question about acceptance through repetition, referring to advertising or political speeches. And the question was, how does that differ from brainwashing? And I know you touched on public relations and advertising in your talk. I'd like to pair that question with another one that came in, and I'll read it to get it verbatim for you.
Sure.
Many U.S. government COVID-19 information and regulation information have been perceived by some groups as brainwashing, with some posts even comparing the COVID-19 regulations to the social control of Hitler and the Nazi occupation. And why do you think the fear of brainwashing shifted from foreign to domestic?
That's a really big question. I might have to do another lecture on this.
Right.
That question is about the history of conspiratorial thinking in the United States, which, in brief, is really a history of people being afraid of outside groups in the 18th and 19th century, such as the Masons, the Illuminati, Catholics. Those groups that, in the 18th and 19th century, Americans were very concerned about the influence of those organizations. In the 1950s and 60s, the subject, the core worry of most conspiracy thinking in the US became the US government. The Kennedy assassination, the UFO cover-up, the 9/11 case, and a couple other major alleged government cases are the main fodder for most conspiratorial thinking right now. Why is that so? The answer, I think, has a lot to do with the development of a massive clandestine government in the 1950s and 60s. We now have a lot of intelligence agencies. Their work we are not allowed as citizens to know exactly what those agencies do, but we are suffused with narratives, films, television shows, books about the work of intelligence agencies. So all of us are very aware of a kind of what in 1962, there was a very notable book called The Invisible Government. This notion that there is an invisible government doing all this kind of work is what fuels the sort of deep state conspiracy theories that we hear so much about. I think it's really important to acknowledge that there are real bases for some of these fears, but also to stress that many of the notions that are being sort of circulated about, many of the concerns that are being circulated about government are really totally unfounded. To go back to the first question, I think one of the really interesting things about brainwashing is just how does it differ from, say, learning, right? Learning is a process of indoctrination, or of repetition of ideas so that you internalize them. And we have, most of us, I hope, I certainly have a very comfortable relationship to the idea of learning as a essential feature. I try to learn every day, and I do that by methods that include putting myself under the influence of another mind and repeating certain kinds of ideas and trying to internalize them. And that doesn't worry me at all. So the point I'm trying to make here is that I think it is very hard to imagine a society in which we do anything without social influence. Social influence is a desirable and good thing. We have to be cautious not to be hysterical when we notice that we're being influenced. There's a kind of all or nothing thinking that happens in which people sometimes notice that they are being influenced, and then they immediately assume that they are being totally controlled, totally influenced, that the influence is pernicious, and also that there is a specific actor who's controlling them.
You mentioned conspiracies about an invisible government, about a deep state. We've had quite a few questions come in asking that you address the QAnon movement. Mm-hmm. They all, kind of hit on the same thing.
Right.
Relationship, is it brainwashing or something along those lines? Yeah,
it's not brainwashing. It might be brainwashing, depending on what you mean by brainwashing. I would distinguish between brainwashing is really, I would like to reserve it for cases where someone is strapped to a gurney and, like a Clockwork Orange kind of thing. What's going on in QAnon is fascinating and for me, very worrying, and one of the reasons why I study subjects like this. The way in which belief is cultivated and reinforced when it is absolutely unsupported by any legitimate knowledge is the basis of social dissolution over history. This is a significant and very worrying problem. So we do need to understand how things like QAnon happen and how they can influence actual political behavior. One of the things I'll just point out about QAnon, there's so much to say about QAnon. A couple of things. One thing is that it is drawing on all of the things that are in the ether around us. Many of us who find QAnon appalling sit down at night and watch movies or films in which the president of the United States is a conspirator, in which the president's staff is conspiring against him, in which there are rogue agents doing all kinds of things, and we say, oh, that's just entertainment. And I think I believe most of us can distinguish well between that and reality. But the fact is, there's a body of narratives that circulates around us that, for some people, becomes the evidence that allows them to understand how a deep state might work if there were such a thing. The other thing I'll just say about QAnon is that QAnon is fun. Not for me, but I think for people that are interested in it, it provides a couple kinds of pleasure at the level of fantasy. So one of the things it provides is this sense of being on the inside. It gives you a sense, if you want to go down the QAnon rabbit hole, that you know something that the sheeple out there, the rest of us, don't know. And you really understand something that's inside. The very idea that there is an inside, that there is something secret that operates at the core of power, is really the underlying belief. And you've been given this kind of access to it. So there's a kind of pleasure in that belief. There's also a pleasure in following the clues. And it's like waiting for the next episode of a television show. What's going to happen next? There are all these cliffhangers, right? People always seem surprised that when the storm doesn't actually happen, the QAnon people believe there's going to be this big storm, a big uprising. When that doesn't happen, people don't leave the movement. But that's just like what happens at the end of a season of 24 or Homeland, right? You come back for more because there is a narrative quality to this. That's probably enough about that. I can see we're getting pretty close to the end of people's time here. Michelle, I can't hear you. You're muted.
Would it be a virtual presentation if that didn't happen?
No.
Well, I think that's a really great place to wrap up. So thank you so much, Dr. Melley, for this enlightening program. The Miami University Alumni Association is grateful that you've generously shared your time. To our viewers, as Dr. Melley mentioned at the top of today's presentation, you're encouraged to become a friend of the Miami University Humanities Center. So for more information, please visit their website at humanitiescenter.miamioh.edu. And for more thought-provoking presentations like the one from Dr. Melley today, visit alumlc.org/MiamiOH, or you can go to our main website, miamialum.org. You can also connect with MUAA on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter. Before we wrap up, an upcoming event that I'd like to highlight is Winter College, which will be offered virtually this year. Dr. Melley is a past presenter at Winter College when we actually travel to somewhere warm, but we can be warm and cozy in our homes and still learn and engage with other Miamians. On February 26th and 27th, Miami alumni and friends can enjoy more than a dozen faculty and staff-led classes, plus conversations with outstanding and really interesting alumni, and even a couple of virtual social events. So please visit miamialum.org/wintercollege. If you'd like to sign up for that, it's totally virtual and totally free. This does conclude today's presentation. So thanks again, Dr. Melley, and love and honor to everyone watching.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.